Welcome to By George, an 80 Players podcast here at the George Theater. I am your host and marketing associate, Miranda Zapes, and today I have with me...
I'm Father Micah Snell. I'm a professor of literature and great books at Houston Christian University and an ordained Anglican, and I'm glad to be here to talk about Bonhoeffer a little bit.
I am so excited to have you here. I will admit that I was a little bit nervous because... And I can't decide if I want to reveal this on the podcast or not. I think we ultimately have to if we're going to be talking about theology and Bonhoeffer and everything. My religious background. So I was raised Catholic, and then I went to college at Houston Christian University. And I said, nope, I don't want to do any of it anymore. I want to be completely removed from it. And I graduated from a Christian university. And it wasn't until I came to 80 Players, a Christian theater, that I thought, oh no, there's a pattern here, and I need to look deeper into this, and I need to self-reflect and everything. And so I consider myself very new to the Christian theology. So if I ask a foolish question, please bear with me.
I'll wait for the someone in our audience might want to know.
Yeah.
Not me.
Exactly.
I got this, but just in case someone else, save them writing in a comment question.
Right, exactly. In case one of our audience members isn't part of this at all. I'm asking for a friend, actually.
Right. I'll be your friend.
Yeah, there we go. Yes, but what do you prefer to be called? Is it Father Snell, Father Micah?
Yeah,
Snell?
I guess if I had my first choice, Father Micah would be my first choice. But my students call me Father Snell or Dr. Snell. I do have a PhD in theology. You know, depending on who you meet from my life, what they call me has changed from decade to decade. But Father Micah is great in this context.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Father Micah, along with all of his other accolades, is the consulting theologian for our theater for 80 Players. And so you've been on with us since about, I want to say the start of the season for Esther.
That's right.
Correct?
This is my first season, so getting close to a year-long run. And Esther was the first production that I consulted on. Although I think consulting is a little bit of an overstatement or overselling what I do. But happy to be here and be a sounding board or, maybe just someone making noise in the corner from time to time.
Making noise? You're helping so much. And so he's consulting on or making noise in the corner about Bonhoeffer. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. But before we get into all of those hard-hitting questions, I first want to hear a little bit more about you, Father Micah. How did you get to this point in Houston Christian University and 80 Players?
Yeah, I'll try and keep it streamlined. So my parents were missionaries and my grandparents were missionaries. So I actually grew up into a heritage of Christian evangelism through overseas ministry mostly. And my growing up years were between South America when I was very young and then Southeast Asia for sort of middle school years, and then home assignments in the Dallas area. So the faith is something that was given to me at an early age, and then growing up and figuring out what it meant for that to be my own faith is kind of a lifelong process. But I decided I wanted to go to a Christian university and ended up at Biola University, where I was a member of the Torrey Honors College, and I'm a perpetual member of the Torrey Honors College, graduated from there. And then back and forth through different phases of interest in teaching, but also pastoral work, and trying to figure out how those things could be compatible, which I didn't think they were. One of the things that's intriguing to me about Bonhoeffer is that he's both someone who values the intellectual or the scholarly side of practical ministry, but then also the pastoral side. So I ended up going to seminary and then working on more graduate degrees. Do you really want the whole litany of all the places that I've studied? It's kind of, you can cut this part out. So my bachelor's degree is from Biola University. Okay. I was an undergraduate and I studied philosophy and great books there. And then I studied classics at UCLA, and my seminary degree is from Nashotah House Theological Seminary. I studied at the University of Dallas for work in English, and then my PhD is from the University of St. Andrews, where I studied theology and the arts with a special emphasis on William Shakespeare and his last plays and the kind of religious significance or potential religious significance of what Shakespeare was doing in those plays at a time which was itself a very volatile time of theological reformation and change. So that's kind of my in. I don't have any real theater experience as a producer doing production or performance or those kinds of things. I've studied the plays. I said to Andy, the playwright, about a week ago, I said, this is great because it's the closest I've really gotten to being part of the hands-on process of seeing something come to life instead of just studying a script on the page, or when you're lucky, getting to go and see a show and then have thoughts about it or talk about it with people afterwards. So that was my academic experience. And then I've either been working in a church and working on graduate studies or academic things on the side, or now for the last 12 years, going on 13 years, I've been a professor at Houston Christian University. My primary role is in the Honors College, where I get to teach great books, including some of the works that Bonhoeffer left for us. And then I do, I'm the coordinator for one of our graduate programs there. I do advising. I do lots and lots of meeting with students. Sometimes they want to talk to me more in a pastoral role. Sometimes it's very academic. Anyways, I'm happy to have lots of things to do until they catch up with me. Yeah. And I'm like, I love having too many things to do. I wish I had fewer things to do. So the balance of those things. But I'm very grateful for having this as another thing to get to. Again, I think consultant is overselling it just a little bit, but I'm grateful for the chance to be here and to be part of what goes on here in a theological context and an artistic context, and to see those things come together in a way that it's not unique, but it's pretty unusual for the sort of consistency and quality of performance and the commitment to the ideals that this theater was founded on, to do those things in a way that Christians have always been interested in the intersection of art in many different forms, and theater being one, music being one, fine art or performance art or those kinds of things, as a way of experiencing theological matters or just human matters that people, regardless of their background, they find a kind of a contact point, and they think about those things. So maybe the last thing I should say is, people come from all kinds of different backgrounds, and very often the background that you're raised up with is not the background you end up in. I grew up evangelical, non-denominational. I've been a practicing Anglican and an ordained Anglican for getting close to 20 years now. But I have really good friends who either grew up similar to me and became Roman Catholic, or Roman Catholics who found a way of practicing their faith. Sometimes they marry a non-Catholic or those kinds of things. Orthodox friends. So seeing the intersection or the coming and going of the different streams of Christianity has been something that I'm blessed to be part of at Houston Christian University, where we're not denominationally limited. There's a place for me, and there's a place for the Catholics who teach in the science department, and the Orthodox people who are liberal arts scholars and those kinds of things. Anyways, that was not a short answer to your question, but that's kind of what got me to this point.
No, I love all of that. Listen, and I'll let you run with it because it is ultimately a fascinating. I mean, just as you're going through your history, and I'm seeing the similarities. I don't know if I should be comparing you to Bonhoeffer, but I'm just looking at I'm going to keep messing up that word, theology aspect of it, and then also going into like a teaching role and Bonhoeffer went even further and was at this like very outspoken activist, but and the arts that also mix in with that. I mean, I think it's all about what makes us human, and that we all find ourselves kind of in these same worlds. Yeah. And I just, Andy, I had him on the podcast, the last episode we did, and he was talking about how teaching is also performing, and so that's his like in with theater. And so now seeing teaching, performing, like theology, how those all they feel like a streamlined path.
Yeah, Bonhoeffer is an interesting example, and I think one who has almost universal appeal. So many people are drawn to him as a kind of lightning rod. I don't know if that's too strong a word, but because he was so interested in theology, and in his 20s and early 30s is writing long theological tomes, but is extremely active in the Church of Germany at the time, and ecumenically he had contacts in his experience in New York and other places, but that it is not just an academic thing or a theological thing, but what you might broadly call the social gospel was something that he deeply cared about. He was committed to this idea of a common life, or sharing life, or acting on behalf of those who need help, or something like that. So his his developing and starting of a seminary, which didn't last very long, but that kind of idealism and how his goal of training pastors whose job was to serve, and the balance of those things, it seems like a difficult balance to strike, but an important balance for those who actually care not just about what they think is true, but actually care about other people and recognize that their role is not just, oh, I'm going to write my books, or, oh, I'm just going to do street ministry, or whatever. The church exists only inside the walls of the church, and what happens outside of that is none of my business. The confluence of all of those things, and that he had so much exposure and interaction with people from other cultures, from other nations, and that he was very interested in the plight of like Black Americans when he encountered that, or his ability to recognize is like, oh, people are being treated in a discriminatory way in my homeland, in my hometown. And standing idly by was not an option in his mind. So yeah, it's a fascinating time, of course, but then a fascinating character within that time to think about and talk about. Yeah.
So you mentioned in teaching at HCU that you have taught on Dietrich Bonhoeffer before, or you've read all of his writings, or some of his writings?
Certainly not all of them.
Yeah.
He wrote a lot, but I've several years ago, I got to teach his book called Discipleship. I have a prop. Can I pull out a prop?
Yes, please.
Okay. You can edit this out if you decide that you didn't get licensing permission. This book, Discipleship. Fine reading. It's an extraordinary thing. And that's one of the books that I have read and taught. And then most recently, for the last couple of years, his book, Life Together, which is kind of his idea for what an ideal communal Christian life would be. Get yours today in the lobby at the George Theater. Oh, no, wait, this is mine. So I've been exposed to certain of his writings and known about him, and he's someone who is actually hard to avoid hearing about. He's been in the news, or he's a popular figure, again, a lightning rod figure perhaps for lots of people, not all of whom I think he would be flattered to have the attention from. Yeah. But he's definitely someone who it's hard to not know about. And then to read his works and see how many of the things he was thinking about, suffering, obedience, grace, how those work out in the life of a disciple or a follower of Jesus or just a virtuous citizen, are challenging and inspiring and not easy, to be confronted by someone whose idealism was very strong and his actions were just as strong, if not stronger. One of the few people we can think of, well, there's lots really, but one of the people we can think of whose willingness to walk the walk was just as strong as his willingness to write letters or write, I was curious, but his book Discipleship was written in 1931. No, that's not right. 37. He was 31 years old when he wrote it. Okay. He was talking about, so this would have been 7 years before his death, 8 years before his death approximately, talking about in very theological detail and very he's very literate. His scriptural literacy, or his ability to point back to the Bible and ground everything he's doing in Scripture, is a good Lutheran trait that he has.
So I wanted to confirm that this wasn't your first experience with Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I mean, coming to see this play and anything like that.
The answer you were looking for is correct.
Yeah. No, you're good. And I'm so glad that you brought it. I just wanted to drive that point home of that this is a prominent figure. And so, and it's interesting because I wish that I would have said this sooner, and I'll say it again now, that this is actually my first interaction with Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And so I wish, and I will let Andy know, when we're not in the middle of an episode, but that I think he's done such a great job of writing and getting a good handle on who he was, because a lot of people, or maybe not a lot of people, maybe just me, the one person, this is going to be their first in with who he was. And so how do you create that character and how do you do that justice?
That's a good point. Yeah. Someone who I've known about off and on for the last, I probably first became aware of him sort of 20 years ago, but it wasn't until I was teaching 10-ish years ago that he came up as a figure that was a part of my own study and teaching. And I was assigned to teach. And so for me, it was, I don't know, I'm glad that I was sort of politely forced to pick up and read Bonhoeffer. I don't know if I would have done it as soon. But yeah, it's kind of good to be like, oh, external motivation is a good thing.
Yeah, of course. Okay, so getting into Bonhoeffer. Again, I don't know how the answers will go, but I'll just start with where I've started basically in the show, and something that you just recently mentioned, Dietrich's thoughts on suffering. It's a point, hopefully by the time you're watching this episode, you have come and seen How to Die. If you haven't, come and see it, because there will be slight spoilers about the topics, but if you've read anything on him, you will also know these topics.
Also, the play opens with a spoiler. So within the first 30 seconds, I think you're like, well, we know how this ends. And if you didn't know then, you know now.
The title also.
Yeah.
Anyways, there is a scene in the play where Dietrich is talking with one of his friends after he's finished a book, and he's talking about suffering, and he says that he wishes that he had faith, and that the weight of faith is through suffering. And they make a joke out of it. His friend says, well, I hope that you get suffering. I hope that you do end up suffering. What do we take from this? I mean, that feels like a very harsh thing to say, that yes, if you want faith, you must suffer. And that can be very jarring. What is Dietrich ultimately trying to say?
Yeah, I'm going to take a liberty and read a few lines, and then you can cut this out if you need to. But he talks about that again. His book Discipleship, which is only several hundred pages long, which is short for a German theological work, and he talks about questions related to that. So here's a few snippets, things that he says. He's working out, I think, a real theology of suffering, and is talking about how grace is an essential part of discipleship, but also that grace is costly. Grace is not cheap. It calls us to follow Jesus. It's costly because it costs people their lives, but it also makes them live. It's an incarnational kind of thing. It's a following of Jesus who suffered. He calls us. Suffering, writes Bonhoeffer, is communion with God, or communion with God is granted precisely in suffering. And suffering is something that must be borne in order for it to pass. We don't deny suffering, or we don't say, oh, you're suffering and it's all your fault that you're suffering. Why are you suffering? You know what you did. You caused your own suffering. The theological attitudes towards suffering, depending from religion to religion, seem to want to either deny suffering or blame the sufferer for their suffering, or to treat it as something like that. But God is a God who bears suffering, does not avoid suffering. Here's a direct quote. His yoke is easy and his burden is light. His yoke and his burden is the cross. Bearing the cross does not bring misery and despair. Rather, it provides refreshment and peace for souls. We're under the same yoke. There is an idea that this suffering works as part of Bonhoeffer's whole theology. He was very systematic. He didn't want to see this problem in isolation or that problem in isolation. One more quote. Christians become bearers of sin and guilt for other people. Christians would be broken by the weight if they were not themselves carried by him who bore all sins. Instead, by the power of Christ's suffering, they can overcome the sins they must bear by forgiving them. A Christian becomes a burden bearer. Bear one another's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ, from Galatians 6:2. As Christ bears our burdens, so we are to bear the burdens of our sisters and brothers. There's a communal aspect of this, and suffering in that way. Discipleship is being bound to Christ. It is an identifying mark of those who choose to follow a Savior who himself did not shirk from suffering, but saw that suffering was an integral part of redemption. How do you heal a broken thing? Well, there's a cost to healing, redemption, and that cost has to be paid. And Christ, according to Christian theology, and Bonhoeffer was a Lutheran. Bonhoeffer's theology, we can't make it better. We can't pay back our own debts or fix our own problems. We need a healer, a redeemer, a savior. And Christ, God becoming incarnate in the person of Jesus, was willing to take on the suffering of the world in a way that the world could not take on for itself. We see this in smaller examples of things like a mom who, just bears up under the burden and toil of raising a child or giving life to a child, or, nourishing, loving, comforting, providing for. But then we also see other examples of sacrificial love. Bonhoeffer is one, but there's many, many other people who have done similar kinds of things, where the martyrs are those who witness through their own sacrifice. And that is a shared burden where, your burden is too heavy for you. You can't bear your own burden. But the Christian idea is that, well, if you can't bear your burden, then if I believe that suffering is part of our human condition, can come alongside, can lighten the load off of you, perhaps take it away, perhaps just help you until you're strong enough to stand. And so that the burden that is yours that you can't endure under, if you're willing to give it up, to accept grace, to accept forgiveness, to love others, even those who hate you or persecute you, that becomes the way, very simplified version of things, a way in which suffering is not just false and not just your own damn fault, but a part of the redemptive process. And Bonhoeffer seems to be someone who, with the main current of Christianity, would say suffering without redemption is cheap grace. Or he calls it, he has some patronizing term for something like middle class or like bourgeoisie religion or something like that. It's like, it's polite, it's external, it makes me feel good, or it makes me look good, or I think it's going to make me rich, or convenient things like that. But really, grace has a cost, and it's a cost that I can't pay for myself. Someone else has to pay it for me. And that feels much more like the greatest examples we have of sacrificial love, of parental love, or a pastor's love for his congregation, or those who choose to see the world around them and want to make it better, and they do so in a way that is sacrificial. And at least the Christian answer would be, well, if it's going to be spiritual redemption, there has to be some kind of spiritual sacrifice that is made that we can't make for ourselves.
So
just say what you're thinking.
Okay. So if we are to suffer, and Jesus took that suffering for us and came down and sacrificed himself, and we are redeemed through him and grace through him, on our level, when we experience day-to-day suffering with our fellow Christians, it is something that when we see other suffering, we should help bear the weight of that suffering.
Good question. And I don't think I can say, oh, there's a simple formula, or this is mechanistic, you calculate, again, we could video game this. It's like your suffering level is up to here. And so you just need a hero whose bearing suffering level is up to here. And, the bars cross over or equal out or anything like that. I think it's more mysterious than that. And I think that the end of Bonhoeffer's life, I wonder about the mysterious nature of the things he was contemplating or experiencing. But yeah, in the sense that, I'm sorry, ask your question again.
Well, it's I guess it's on an hour, and I don't like to say our level, but if we see someone else suffering, what are we to do, or what can we do to help them?
Yeah.
What should they ask of us, if they should ask anything of us?
Yeah. Compassion comes from love, a place of love, love one another, and so fulfill the law of Christ. What does it mean to see someone, and maybe you can't put yourself 100% into their shoes? I mean, sometimes you can. If you've been homeless, it's much easier to empathize with people who have been homeless. Or if you, I don't know, have been through addiction or something like that and have recovered from that, you might be able to empathize. Mostly, it seems like what we're called to do is to try and recognize, love one another is not a command of convenience. It is love. What does it mean to do that? Well, yeah, I don't meet everybody in the world. I come across however many people in any given day, or the people that I see on a regular basis. Some you get to know really well. Some you get to know in a way where you can think more deeply or feel more closely connected to them in a way that, family members have a kind of bond that non-family members don't share. Or sometimes it can be vocational. I know more about people who are in academic or teaching kind of positions and can ask them my questions or ask them for advice or those kinds of things. But it does really seem to go to a more particular place of, what are you doing about it in ways that are particularly tangible or real? Or, it's one thing for me if I walk past you on the street and I was like, hey, Miranda. And I'm like, well, God bless Miranda. She's probably suffering. Okay, God, make it better. That's maybe not the worst thing to do, but also, do you ever find out about it? What does it look like to show people materially or directly or in a way that costs you something? If we run into each other at a coffee shop, they're like, hey, coffee time, good talk. Even in a very simple example of like, hey, let me get your coffee for you. It's like, oh, there was a actual material that cost me something. Did it cost me everything? Probably not to buy somebody a cup of coffee. Does it cost me $1 to give $1 to a homeless person? Yes. Do I miss that $1? Probably not. Those kinds of commitments or sacrifices, they can scale. We're not always called to make the ultimate sacrifice. You're not probably called to lay down your life every single day, every single hour for every single person that you come in contact with. It's a matter of being called. But it's a strange balance. There's lots of people who are very socially conscious, or they're, we found out yesterday, I'm not sure when this will go out, but it was announced yesterday that Pope Francis had passed away early Monday morning, I believe. And a lot of the tributes to him recognized his compassion for those who suffer, those who are the victims of war, those who need peace, or those who are just, impoverished or homeless or displaced or sick or those kinds of things. How do you know what your sacrifice should be? When you should make it, if you should make it, is it always, never? I have a feeling Bonhoeffer would be like, always empty your wallet for everybody you come in contact who needs money. Maybe he wouldn't say that, I don't know. But as someone who himself benefited from the generosity of others, it does seem like what you give will come back to you in ways that may not be material. It's not like if I buy you coffee once, you're going to buy me coffee for the rest of my life.
Right.
But sometimes those small gestures affect other people in ways, and maybe this is the last part of this rambly answer, is it's kind of our business to notice or see those who need compassion, need material help, need something. It's not necessarily our business to calculate or anticipate or hold on to the results of that thing. How many of the people that Bonhoeffer directly contributed to helping them knew the extent to which he helped them, or were ungrateful, or I'm sure we've all done favors for people. I actually bought a donut for a homeless guy who was in line at me one time, and he's like, okay, thanks. And I was like, oh. I was sort of expecting a clap on the back, or like, hey, thank you for, and it was okay, right? But those kinds of, ours is the, oh, where am I? What am I supposed to do with what I am, where I am? I don't imagine I could easily do what someone like Bonhoeffer did. But apparently, at least so far, that's not my role. My role is, okay, who's going to come through my office door and need to talk to me? And I'm always happy to shut my email off and talk to a person instead of, an email inbox. But what do they need? How can I do my best to listen or pray or respond in such a way that hopefully it makes a difference, but then they leave and it's not my job to keep score or follow up, or, the next week be like, hey, so that thing you talked to me about, did you win or whatever?
Yeah. It's fascinating. So there's this, I love everything that you said about noticing and on these small scales what we can do. But my mind leads me down way of, yes, in suffering. And in the quote that you read, it talked about this communal and helping others and relying on others and these kinds of things. And then it brings me to the end of the play where Dietrich has to deal with all this suffering completely alone. And I can't even begin to imagine what that was like, how he got through that. But then it takes me further down this, like as a storyteller and an artist, how God works in these ways where he wrote about this and he talked about this, and then for him to experience it in isolation, I guess. And then continuing down the path of like God's will for us and living out his plan for us is so challenging. I don't know if there's a question in there somewhere, but I guess how do we follow that path? How do we know what's God's will for us? Is there?
Yeah, we're into deep theological waters where I'm pro Sunday school, and I've benefited from going to Sunday school for most of my growing up life.
Yeah.
But then also occasionally, more often than I would have guessed, something happens and I'm like, this was not covered in Sunday school.
Yeah.
One thing you mentioned is the question of Bonhoeffer being alone.
Mm-hmm.
So the theological answer could have several facets. One is that the believer is never truly alone.
Right. Mm-hmm.
That Bonhoeffer would say that Christ was with him in his suffering, or he was surrounded, as the book of Hebrews says, by so great a cloud of witnesses. If angels are real, there are lots of them.
Mm-hmm.
And they could be anywhere. And how many angels were with Bonhoeffer in his suffering? Unknown. At least I don't know the answer to that. I assume that is an unknown quantity. Mm-hmm. There's also, I think Bonhoeffer would say, the fellowship of believers, where even if you were not physically present with somebody, there are those who are also fellow sufferers or co-laborers, people who I'm sure prayed for him. His correspondence, I understand, was a major lifeline for him. And are you alone if you have the letters of someone that have been written to you? Sort of, but the sense of feeling the comfort, or I was going to say the presence, I'm not sure that's the right word, feeling the fellowship that exists even for the person who might be in solitary confinement or in isolation. Mm-hmm. The whole company of heaven, believers who have died and gone on before, or those who come up. I don't know how much he was actually alone. It sounded like he had a pretty robust pastoral ministry in prison, mm-hmm. and maybe mostly ministering to others. Mm-hmm. In some ways, it in my imagination at least, Bonhoeffer, who at a young age was like, I'm going to be a pastor. His final act in life was very pastoral, praying with those who are bereaved or suffering or persecuted, giving counsel, giving comfort, writing letters, thinking out ideas, doing practical works on behalf of others. I've pondered, and the play kind of nods to Bonhoeffer being alone the night before his death.
Right. And I think that's what I was getting at with the final isolation. But
yeah, I have been reflecting. I've now seen the play once, and I was at a dress rehearsal and I was at the read through, and have reflected each time a little more deeply, not because I have answers, but just also to wonder, what was Bonhoeffer's last night like? Mm-hmm. To me, he looks more and more like someone who is playing the character of Christ in the play of his life. That Christ too was captured and imprisoned, and the night before his death spent some amount of time feeling alone. Mm-hmm. My guess is that for Bonhoeffer, I don't know. Did he sleep? There's a joke in the play about, you're going to wake me up. We also have the information in the play that sleeping was particularly difficult for him. Maybe those periods of isolation, he felt more pointedly the suffering his own suffering, or I suspect to a great degree, the suffering of those around him, and that he was, maybe consciously, but certainly in some intentional or specific way, was bearing the suffering of those around him in a way that I would like to believe made that suffering bearable for people who knew him or who he interacted with, or that became a means of grace through him to those who were around him. Mm-hmm. Did he sleep? Did he pray the whole night? Was he in some form, experiencing that transformation that people who are martyred sometimes experience, where they become increasingly detached from this world and more attached to eternity in a way that, again, based on the accounts, at least in the play, he seems to go to his death graciously, pretty peacefully, humbly, praying. I assume, I don't remember if it's specific, praying for his captors and those who were about to execute him, thinking with compassion on those around him rather than his own particular plight. And in a way, being lifted up. Jesus was crucified. Sometimes there's the euphemism of being hanged on a tree that was used to refer to the death of the Messiah, but that Bonhoeffer also was hanged. It is not exactly the same form of death, but I can't escape the image, the Christological image of Bonhoeffer like Jesus, accepting his fate and accepting that he was the victim and praying that his sacrifice would be one that makes a difference for those around him. Or even, I think ultimately, if Bonhoeffer had lived, if he'd stayed alive for another couple of weeks until that particular prison was liberated, what would his ministry have been if he had lived? Let's assume it would have been extraordinary. He was an extraordinary man, but different in what we have, because his whole life and writing and work was brought into the very, very sharp focus of living into the full measure of conviction and dying. And could he have avoided it at the end? Probably not. But how many chances did he have before that to escape, or to be somewhere that would have been safer, or not to go into the lion's den? I love the music in the play.
I love it.
He volunteered for the lion's den, and people are like, but he got eaten, and he's like, yeah, I understood that would be a possibility. And so it's like, I'm imagining a little bit what Bonhoeffer's internal monologue would have been like. But that loneliness, which is such a besetting problem in today's day and age. Is it worse than it ever has been? I don't know. I suspect loneliness has always been a real possibility for humans. He seems like the kind of person who was happy to be busy, but also may have been happy to be left alone. But ultimately, it's kind of a matter of faith or speculation, or this is a thing that theater does, right? Is forces you into a new imaginative circumstance where it's like, oh, I never thought about this before. I'm thinking about this now because of, history and a script and a play and, an embodiment in a theatrical context of these things. Maybe someday in eternity we'll find out, or maybe this is a particular instance, and assuming the best and assuming the most about Bonhoeffer's character, that I would choose to believe that in his last night on earth, in his last moments, that he opened himself up to God in a way that is particular to that circumstance, and felt God's presence, or was comforted, or experienced communion with God in a way that is unique to those who suffer and unique even to those who are martyred. And probably the simplest term I can think of is like, to our eyes, it would look miraculous, and probably would be miraculous. But yeah, I don't know how you go through what Bonhoeffer went through without some kind of supernatural intervention on your behalf for peace that passes understanding, for grace that costs everything. And in choosing to follow Christ, or the opening quote of the play, I believe, is like, when when Christ bids someone follow, he bids him come and die. Or I've butchered that slightly. But that sounds really good when you're, a hotshot in your 20s and writing theology and you're the rising star in German theological circles or whatever. But yeah, as you say, the person who wishes Bonhoeffer's like, I hope you get what you're asking for.
Yeah.
Did he know what he was asking for? I don't know.
One that I just want to point out and just have clarification for myself, to hear you talk about the similarities between Christ and Bonhoeffer rubs me the wrong way. And I think, we should not be comparing Christ to a human figure. And I think I part of me feels that it's wrong and part of me knows that it's not wrong. And so I wonder if you can speak briefly to that. Like, is there a negative connotation to making that comparison?
I suppose anything could be taken too far or in the wrong way, or we're all guilty of misunderstanding things. My favorite, this is a terrible example, it came to mind. Maybe I should keep it to myself, but there's the part in that great theological work, Talladega Nights, the Ballad of Ricky Bobby, where, have you seen this Will Ferrell movie? But they're sitting around the dinner table and they're all praying in various terrible iterations to Jesus as, I like to picture Jesus this way to myself. I think of Jesus this way. It was like, to me, Jesus is this kind of a person. And they're all just sort of like obviously bad caricatures of the person of Jesus. So do we do that? Yeah, but we all do that to some extent. Imagining celebrities or characters or, this is who I know my parents to be. And then we all probably at some point have that, this is who I thought my parents were. It turns out they're more complicated than that. Or I never knew that about so-and-so. So part of it could be, you're right, it's good to be cautious and not just say, to me, Jesus means, and then we make up something that's more imaginary than actual. I guess I would say, again, pointing to Bonhoeffer's ideas in the book Discipleship and elsewhere, is, Jesus says, follow me. And he gives the examples of Peter the Apostle is one of his examples, who is told twice to follow Christ. Once it's when, Peter and his friends and partners were cleaning the nets and they're fishermen, and Jesus is like, come follow me. And Peter's like, bet. He's like, okay. Is not, what am I getting myself in for? But then also, there's after Peter goes through all the ups and downs of being with Jesus, and Jesus again at the end is like, do you love me? And Peter has to wrestle with that question and basically gives the answer, I'm doing my best, Lord, but I'm not sure how good it is. And Jesus again is like, follow me. His call is to be like him. So, Messiah complexes can go very badly, for sure. But also, the very name Christian comes from those who are little Christs, or were meant to follow Christ's example, not that we can do everything that Christ, the Son of God, did, but that we are called to be imitators, so that in our imitation of what he did, there will be the knock-on effect or the results also of, so I'm not conflating, I hope I'm not conflating or haven't given the impression that I was like,
No.
Bonhoeffer was Jesus. But the sense of, it's hard for me to escape the parallels between what Bonhoeffer experienced. Some ways very, very different. But it's sort of, if you say they're completely different, then you start to notice uncanny parallels between the role of Christ or the life of Christ, and then also, the things that Bonhoeffer taking up for the down and out, loving those who needed a particularly sacrificial kind of love, correcting those in authority. It's another scene in the play which is striking, but even maybe a little bit understated in the play, that when Bonhoeffer confronts all of the other Lutheran pastors, and there's this conflict, that the pastors there are the Lutheran pastors of the established church. It's the church that is really closely tied to the German government and has been kind of since the Reformation, as I understand it. Well, then you get used to having government support, government benefits, protection, compensation, I don't know what all. You imagine that the Nazi health plan was really good, and the German pastors were like, well, I don't want to lose my health benefits. And, it's just a little bit of compromise, right? And Bonhoeffer's like, no,
right.
That he is not just having a theological disagreement. He's saying, hey, the Lutheran Church, you're in bed with the Nazi party, and that's wicked. And there's no way that you can do this in good conscience. So he is someone who's not just writing or acting. He at least has moments of Jesus confronting the religious authorities of his day and saying, you guys are the worst. You're like more part of the problem than the poor, sick outcasts and, refugees. So how far can you take it? Ooh, good question. Probably too far if I'm not careful. But also the sense in which those kinds of things are, Bonhoeffer seems to have taken very seriously. It's like, Jesus says, come follow me. So I'm doing my best. And here's where I am. What would Jesus do? Which became a cliche. I don't know if you're old enough to remember the what would Jesus do bracelets and all of that kind of thing.
It's so funny you say that, because we found one this morning. We found one.
In like a costume drawer or something?
No, I don't know. Our rentals manager brought it to me and said, did you lose this? And I think she found it on the floor in our theater. But
yes, that was mine. Oh, where did it go? This is not really apropos of anything other than what would Jesus do? I saw a bracelet once that had a whole bunch of letters strung along it. And I was like, what does that stand for? And someone said, it was probably a meme on the internet, but it said, Jesus probably wouldn't have gotten himself into this situation in the first place. It was like JP, whatever those initials were.
Right.
It's easy enough to say, what would Jesus do? You're not Jesus. Don't confuse what Jesus would do with what you're capable of doing. On the other hand, someone like Bonhoeffer is like, well, if following Christ is not just a day job or something I do for fun, but is a whole way of life, as someone who did his best, I believe, to follow Christ when Christ calls, and then to, be aware, be present, be in that situation. I doubt he was perfect. I doubt he was sinless. But in the sense of, doing his imperfect best. And then ultimately, again, we were talking about this a few minutes ago. Ultimately, it's not up to us to determine the results or only act based on what we think is a calculated result that will come. But, my job is to love or to serve or to work in whatever way and trust that the results are God's business, not my business. And sometimes we like the gratification of seeing it's like, hey, I did a thing. It's like, I was on a podcast. I was on By George, and they got 1 million views.
Right.
I did that. It was like, a few weeks, like, good news, we're up to like 50 views. And I was like, that's not on me, right? We want to do the math on, did I do this? Did I not do this? Was it? No, our part really matters. But ultimately, we should do our best to act faithfully and be grateful and trust that a lot of it is not our business, and we may never find out how we affected somebody or those kinds of things.
That's so interesting. And I want to clarify that I wasn't trying to make a comment on that you'd taken the comparison too far. It was something that, as you had said it had rubbed me the wrong way. And I was like, why does that rub me the wrong way? And so I'm thankful for your explanation. Yeah. And to go back to, we're not meant to know, we may never know in these contexts. It's something that Dietrich brings up in the play, and I'm sure in his works, or maybe his family brings it up at the very beginning, that theologians are supposed to have all of these answers. And it's something that, as we're talking, I'm realizing that I feel like I've put the pressure on you to have these answers. But I love that in all of your responses, that it is it's okay not to know, and it's okay to know that this, at the end of the day, it is about its service and loving and caring. And so I just also wanted to just commend you on that for thank you for taking on this.
I don't like compliments, but thank you. Okay.
I will ask one hopefully final question relating to the perfect question. Well, the big question of the Life of Dietrich Bonhoeffer is about a theologian being in a conspiracy to assassinate Hitler.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is something that you feel comfortable to speak on, want to speak on, but I wanted to at least bring up the topic. And I think it actually goes in hand with what we were talking about earlier, at least with suffering. I mean, Bonhoeffer suffered. There was all of these people suffering as well. And how does one come to that decision?
A few thoughts. If I'm lucky, I'll tie them all together, or at least maybe point them in the direction of each other. So one sort of stream of concern would be the balance of, I'm sorry, I forgot the name of Bonhoeffer's French colleague and friend when he was in New York, who's a pacifist and says, basically, his view is the biblical position is we are never called to fight back or to turn the other cheek. We're to accept persecution, but never be, those who persecute. And apparently Bonhoeffer genuinely wrestled with that question in such a way that he had deep sympathy with it. And it's like, read the Bible. It's hard to find any place where Jesus is like, we need more swords or, time to line up for war. That does not seem to have been indicated anywhere. The question of how should one act, or, is murder ever justified, or can you fight a war? The other extreme side. And after we did the talk back last week, someone came up to me in the lobby and said, well, I'm paraphrasing and generalizing away from the specifics of the question, but it was basically, well, if I know someone is coming after me and my family, don't I have some kind of moral obligation to strike first? If someone is coming to kill my children, shouldn't I kill them? Sort of metaphorically. It was also asked in a very rhetorical form of, well, surely if I know that someone is coming for me, or if I know that Nazis are coming to perpetrate genocide against my people, shouldn't I do everything within my power, even preemptively, to not be a victim? I'm not a pacifist. I think I would fall somewhere personally in the fighting wars is sometimes necessary for those to protect the innocent. So starting a war, probably not a good idea. Or, going back to the playground, the question of, did you start the fight or did you finish the fight? Because those are two different places to be in. If you started a fight, it's not theologically a very solid ground to be standing on. There are also, and I got one or two questions. I don't know how much this is in line with what you're talking about. Basically, like, it seems like there were a few people who were being evil and coercing others into going along with it. And a few people, or sorry, not a few, but, a percentage of the population or the people who were victims, and then a large middle chunk that were just kind of didn't do anything. And it's true that it's very easy to fall into the, I don't want to lose my security, or I don't want to put my family at risk, or I don't want to suffer any consequences for anything I do. That sense of security might be false, but it's a sense of security anyways. My wife reminded me, she read a book about people who you would not necessarily have known what they were doing, but they were very integral into efforts to do the right thing. The name of the book is escaping me. But the example at the beginning of the book is some mid-level bureaucrat. He was Portuguese, and I don't think he was Jewish himself, but he had the ability as a bureaucrat to process paperwork. And he always worked for or worked kind of in collusion with the Nazis. At least it looked like he did. But based on the estimates, he's someone who never raised his head up so high. He was never the blade of grass that raised up so high it got cut off. But he was someone who they think casual estimates of somewhere like 30,000 people. He processed paperwork to get them into Portugal, which was a neutral country. And so the number of people that he helped by seemingly not opposing the Nazis or drawing attention to himself in such a way that he himself, there were lots of people who resisted the Nazis or stood up to them and paid with their lives also. Early conscientious objectors, or those who objected, usually very swiftly felt the consequences of that. Bonhoeffer is an interesting example also because he's someone who, to what extent was he interested in supporting an assassination attempt? I think the play emphasizes that. It's an interesting plot line. It's not clear to me how much personally Bonhoeffer was really, really committed to the other part or the other thread of his role working officially or allegedly with the Nazis is, raising awareness by traveling or getting people who were at risk, getting Jews out of Germany. How much did he know about the plot or allow it to go on with his knowledge or not stop it? Or how much did he really actively contribute to however many plots there were to assassinate Hitler? Like I said, so many things swirling around here. And the question of should he have stood up at a rally and said Hitler is evil, and they would have dragged him off and killed him immediately? Should he have stayed overseas where he could raise awareness? Or maybe again a matter of no two callings are alike. Some people are called to be conspicuous victims. Others are called to bear the shame of working with the system, at least looking like you're working with the system. But then like doctors who never sort of raised their heads up high enough for the Nazis to take notice of them, would like write medical visas. It was like, oh, this person is really sick and needs to go to a health resort in Switzerland. Not, this is a Jew who needs to get out of the country, or a persecuted one of the other. But anyways, so all of those kinds of things. What should you do? Standing by and doing nothing is the easy task or the easy path. Should Bonhoeffer have tried harder to assassinate Hitler? Should, how much should we let politics dictate what we do? How do we separate all of those things? I'm not a pacifist. I think war is terrible, and the great risk in war is that being part of a war, you will commit atrocities or evil things will happen, or there will be consequences that you can't foresee. And, the secondhand effects of my actions may lead to death or starvation or displacement or those kinds of things. We're told as Christians, love one another, don't harm one another, but also protect the innocent. Lay down our lives, even up to laying down our lives for those who are vulnerable and need protecting. And I read a thing, apparently at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., one of the most striking things is that there's a large pile of shoes of those. And the author I was reading, the comment that struck him was how many of the shoes were children's shoes. And apparently, I think I read 1.5 million of the victims of the Holocaust were children or young people. I hadn't heard that statistic in a while. That's heavy. Yeah. What should we do? Hopefully have courage and conviction and know, well, is this where I make my stand? Or is this the part where, for some, you think about characters like Oskar Schindler, who allegedly, again, was complicit in the work of the Nazis, but did ultimately a lot to protect those who were under his care, to try and sort of buy Jews back from the Nazi regime so that they could work for him. There are a lot of stories like that. And yeah, I don't know. Yeah. What would I have done? I'm not sure I can say. I hope I would have had the courage to be willing. Yeah. Someone said, well, could you kill Hitler? And I was like, I don't know. I think I'd be lying if I said I knew the answer to that question. I hope I would have the courage and willingness to lay my life down for the love of others or out of faithfulness to God. Could I be part of a assassination plot? So far, I haven't been tested in that way. And maybe that's a sign of God's grace to me that I haven't had to decide. So Miranda, what would you do if you were called into an assassination plot? Would you be the gun runner? And I'm just trying to lighten the mood on feeling sober here. It's deep waters. It's the kind of thing where answers are one thing, and then real life happens, and all of us are challenged to wonder what we should do, and hopefully have the faith and obedience to fulfill our roles uniquely as we are called. And I think Bonhoeffer is a startling example of someone who is extremely willing to do that and had a particular extraordinary ministry. Not a very long life. I guess, he didn't make it to his 40th birthday, I think. Accomplished a lot.
Absolutely.
In the life he had, and then made a faithful end.
I think ultimately, I love the questions that you're posing, because I think ultimately that's what this is, and that's what coming to see the show is. That's where me and Andy ended our last episode, was please come in and see the show and be open to having your mind open in this way, and to begin thinking about these topics and these subjects, and to just be open to being challenged. And so, yes, I knew that this was going to be a semi-different episode, because there's aren't exact answers to any of these questions, but I think ultimately it's a conversation that opens the doors, that opens your mind to a lot of different, sit with these challenging thoughts and reflect on them and pray on them. And I love these types of conversations. So thank you so much for being here.
I was just going to say, and I had a chance to Q&A with Andy, like I said, a week ago, and I was grateful for the chance to say to him publicly, but I think in a way that is, again, made me deeply reflective, that if you say what I really believe is true, is that Bonhoeffer's life, his circumstances, again, bear uncanny resemblances to life before and our life now. And I'm not saying, I think some people want to do this with Bonhoeffer. It's like, oh, Bonhoeffer did this, therefore we should assassinate politicians that we hate. I was like, well, I don't think, so, the copy paste answer is not what we should do, almost certainly, but in that it is a story of his time. But again, the uncanny similarities are the ways in which it is a story for our time. When you see political instability or turmoil, or wars breaking out in places that are, are they going to go away? Are they going to get bigger? Is there I just wanted to say the sense in which this is a story which has deep significance as a moral example for our time, where, hopefully we are challenged and we have fruitful reflections and can share our thoughts and convictions with others, but then be drawn into, all right, how am I supposed to live then? And being comfortable and trying to protect what's mine is probably not what will serve either me or those around me if I love them. The food for thought is a rich banquet.
Exactly. We do have our last little lightning round. So we'll start, and to kind of lighten the mood, this is always my first lightning round question. What is a mishap, a blunder that has happened to you in your career? So typically I'm talking with theater people, and something that's happened on stage, something that's happened backstage. But what is something that maybe a blunder in your life that keeps you up at night?
Oh, that's a light question?
A fun question.
A fun question? Sometime that I died on stage at the wrong time?
And that you're okay sharing with us now. You don't have to say the one that still keeps you.
Important qualifier.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is what you're thinking. So I do perform. I don't know if perform is the right word, but as an Anglican pastor, I do serve in church every Sunday. And so I've said things in sermons that afterwards you're like, why did I say that?
Yeah.
Or things happen, we have people moving, things happen, things go here or there. So the one that comes to mind, it was during the Easter service, we had a candle that went out. And it's this, darkness, and then Easter, light.
Right.
And then halfway through, a candle goes out, and I was like, well, we need to get that relit. And if you've ever had the moment where it's like something is wrong on stage and you have to fix it, and every second feels like an eternity, and So that's the most recent example that I can think of is like, oh, I guess I'm going to be the one to figure out where something to light a candle is, the Easter candle, no less.
Right.
And get it lit. And then the wick had like fallen down in the wax. And so I'm like, like you could just hear the like Jeopardy music in your head, like, and everybody's eyes are like watching you.
Right.
So I think we laughed it off. And in good German fashion, I told the guy who's helping me, I was like, well, I guess we owe each other a beer for that one. But that was the latest kind of like, oh, stories we'll laugh about someday, but right now feels like dying on stage.
Right, exactly. How has, now that you've seen this show on stage, has any of your opinions, own theology changed anything for you?
I think it put into focus for me things I had known about Bonhoeffer's writing or his life, but it's really uncanny to see how many things he wrote 5-10 years before the climax. He was writing and saying all of these things in ways that strike me as brilliant young idealism. And still, again, harder for me on the other side of 40 to say a 39-year-old is old. But someone who in his mature life or having, reached that stage really had to wrestle with and live out his convictions in a way that makes me wonder, again, if he had lived, how much of his own theology would he have stood by and how many things would he have refined or changed or deepened in his understanding of. But to see the way in which he really had an uncanny experience of, imagine someone found, I don't know if you journal, but if you journaled as a youth and you're like, when I'm older, I'm gonna, what if someone found that? I was like, okay, now the climax is you're gonna live out all of those things you said about your younger self. And seeing in the way that we have his, now's the test of what I said I believed. And I think the play does a really good job of heightening that, of portraying that in a way that both illuminates but also allows for further thought.
And finally, why should people come see the play?
Again, I would like to contest that you're calling these lightning round questions. Because.
Yeah. Because it's good and that's it. because. Yeah.
I think that any chance that we as Christians or people of faith, or even people who wrestle with their faith or would say they don't have faith, have an opportunity to see these things colliding in ways that cause them to look from a different perspective or say, oh, I never thought about it that way. Or, ooh, that's an uncomfortable thought that I can't shake. That theater is a place. The idea of the theater is a crucible or a microcosm or a place where you get these, my interest in Shakespeare is coming out here, but it's like, what this play needs is a play within the play so that people in the play can see what's going on in the play. And we who are watching the play in the play have that. That there is this, you exit from normal life into the theater and then you see this, they turn up the heat on all of the things and you're like, oh, this is like life. Yeah. But I'm grateful for the work of, all those who have put together a script and the production and all the technical side of things. And the actors are really great. I've been really blessed to just experience it. I mean, one reason you should come is it's a delightful, challenging, not happy delightful, maybe delightful is not the right word, but sort of like moving experience. And, if you need to step out of life for a couple hours and reflect on something that is challenging and encouraging and also really great art, I can't think of a better way to spend your children's inheritance than as a patron and audience member and donor to the George Theater.
That was a perfectly executed answer. I couldn't have planned that better myself. Well, Father Micah, thank you so much for being on this episode of By George. I really appreciate you sitting down and kind of discussing all of this with me.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Well, when you guys come in to see How to Die, the Life of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, as you should, It is playing from April 9th through May 4th. We're getting towards the tail end of that, so please get your tickets as soon as possible. And again, be open to the challenges and the questions that it poses. And I'll just leave it there because I think Father Micah answered the question perfectly. But thank you guys so much for listening, and we will see you guys next time.
Thanks, Brenda.
Thank you. This has been By George, an 80 Players at the George Theater podcast, hosted and produced by Miranda Zapes. Listen anywhere you listen to podcasts and follow us on Instagram at By George Theater. That's THEATRE. Sure to like, share, and subscribe. And By George, we'll see y'all next time.